We will now begin with the first session for the day, the theme for which is 1971 Indo-Pak War Reflections. We have with us a very distinguished panel for this session, chaired by Air Marshal Harish Masant, Veer Chakra, VM. Air Marshal Harish Masant was commissioned as a fighter pilot in December 1967 and soon saw action in the liberation of Bangladesh in 71 while flying Hunter aircraft from Hashimara and won a Veer Chakra for gallantry. He inducted the MiG-29 as a squadron commander in 1987 and the Su-30s as a base commander in 97. He is a flying instructor, fighter combat leader, a graduate of the Defense Service Staff College, and an alumnus of the Air War College in the USA, class of 93. He has also served as an instructor in many training institutes. It is a pleasure to have you here, sir. I request you to kindly take over.
Yeah, okay. Air Chief Marshal Tipnis, sir, DG Caps, Air Marshal Anil Chopra, and all the distinguished guests. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I don't think I needed that. I think most people already know my reputation. Over here, I'm very privileged to have a very eminent panel with me, very illustrious people who've done so well in their careers. And because there is very little time, I personally don't need to introduce them because you know them all very well. And those who don't know them can try and get hold of a copy of the book where they've written chapters and their biodata is also given there. But I'm very proud that today all these people who worked with me before and I've been with them are with me today to discuss the air operations, particularly in the East and a little bit of the West. So on my left, Air Marshal Vikram Singh, who's the SASO of Western Air Command, and then Air Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, who's a known historian, scholar, all of us have read his books, and Air Marshal Diptendu Chaudhary, who's the present commandant of the NDC. More on them, you can read about it. What I intend to do is request, I also have Group Captain Shamsul Alam, who's going to join us in the end for about 5 minutes on his reflections of Kilo Flight. Once again, I think the Air Chief in his introduction already mentioned the part that Wing Commander Group Captain Alam played in this whole war, and he's also a recipient of the second highest gallantry award in Bangladesh, the Bir Uttam Swadhinata Padak. So we look forward to hearing from him. I personally will request the speakers to speak, I was told, for about 15 minutes each, so that we have at the end, and Shamsul Alam for about 5 minutes, so that we have adequate time for the audience and online people who've got questions to query us instead of us giving you a monologue. So over to you, Polly. Thank you.
माउस नीचे कहाँ रखा है? ये पावर पॉइंट कहाँ रखें? अच्छा ये विक्रम सेकंड ये सेकंड and this is the clicker. Either side? Yeah. This is right. Chief Marshal Tipnis, sir, senior veterans who are sitting here, especially the veterans who've taken part in the 71 war, DG Caps, distinguished guests from outside, ladies and gentlemen. Now, it is my very difficult task to start the session on what I think is a very boring subject, discussing the numbers of the war, especially in a war like this where there was very large disparity or seemingly large disparity in the numbers. So my talk is squaring off the balance of forces in December 1971 between the Indian Air Force and the Pakistan Air Force. So just to give you a brief background, initially after partition in 1954, the Pakistanis threw in their lot with SEATO and CENTO and were therefore able to weaponize their armed forces with primarily US weapons, which they got through the MAP program. The Indian Air Force went the British way, stayed British for some time, bought some French aircraft, and bought whatever it could. It was not that we didn't try to get the Starfighter or the F-102, but we were denied these aircraft, we were denied the Lightning from the British, etc. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we signed up with the Soviets, and our entire armed forces, the major part of the armed forces, became Russian. For good or for bad, I think for the first about 20, 30 years for good. So by the time of the 1965 war, the Pakistan Air Force was entirely from the US, and the Indian Air Force was almost completely British and French. The 1971 war, just a brief background, as you know, was, well, the partition of India was based on the theory that no two nations of two different religions can exist as one nation, or the two-nation theory. And the 1971 war actually began in 1948, when the president of Pakistan in the parliament said that Urdu will be the new national language in West and East Pakistan. And that is really where the 71 war began, when the Bengalis said that we have a different identity and a different language and a different culture. So ultimately, 1970, when the elections were held and the Awami League in East Pakistan had a landslide victory, Bhutto at that time, who was president of the PPP, he refused then to come into parliament and said that this election should be completely declared null and void. And in March 1971, ultimately, when all the civil unrest began in the east and Mujibur Rahman was taken into custody. And in fact, a small detail here, there was a Colonel Z.A. Khan who went to his house and picked him up, was the same guy who was sacked by Niazi in the east and sent to the west in September 71 to raise a new tank unit, that is 51 Armored Brigade. And this was the armored brigade that got hammered by the hunters at Jaisalmer. By then, once the mass exodus of refugees that took place after the crackdown, India was sure that it would have to go to war, at least in East Pakistan. And we were, from March onwards, preparing to go to war, and then it was decided that it was meaningless to try and invade in a country which had 7,000 kilometers of rivers in it before the rains ended. So it was planned that by around end of November is when we would go into East Pakistan, and which is what happened. That is when the Indian Army actually went into East Pakistan on the 21st of November in the Garibpur area. So at the end of the 1965 war, the balance of forces was something like this. It looks rather stark because Pakistanis had about 147 aircraft. I'm only talking fighters. And the Indian Air Force had about 460. But if you see that after the attacks in the east, we more or less did not use the Vampires and the Tufanis. So it was actually about 348 against 165. And even from these aircraft, a large number of these were tied up in the east. And after the first attacks that we carried out at Chittagong, the whole war in the east more or less settled down. So it was really a war in the west. So it was actually about 250 against 165. These were the losses. As you can see at the bottom, there were significant losses on our side. There were 25 in the air. There were 11 accidents, including being shot down by our own attack. There were 37 lost on the ground, to a total of 73. The Pakistanis admit that they lost 19, but we estimate, including accidents, is about 25. So rather stark differences, and a large number of lessons that we had to learn after the 65 war. It was only after the 65 war that the government of India declared Pakistan as an enemy state. And this allowed serious focus to build up the armed forces to fight Pakistan. Until then, of course, the main fear and the main focus was China after the 1962 debacle. Both nations had been embargoed by the US. It did not matter to us much because we had very few aircraft from the US, very few radars. And thereafter, the Indian Air Force executed a massive expansion. We built blast pens. I think we ended up with about 145 blast pens on all our airfields in the west. And we also set up in early 71 the TC and DTS because we realized that in the air our tactics may not be up to scratch. We also inducted second-hand aircraft. Large number of second-hand Hunters and Canberras were bought because the British were not willing to help at that time. And of course, a large number of MiG-21s and Su-7s were inducted, which made the Air Force a little more modern than it was in 1965. Large number of P-30 radars that came along with the MiG-21s, the IL-14s, the AN-12s, and the SAM-2s were also inducted. We had something like 30 P-30 radars. We also got the modified SAM-2s. Up till then, they couldn't engage a target above 1,000 feet. But at the 71 war, about half the fleet of SAM-2s were able to engage targets between 800 feet to 1,000 feet, what was considered low level at that time. This was based on what the Russians or the Soviets had learned during the Vietnam War. Also, there was a change of command on 16th July 69. Our beloved Chief of the Air Staff at that time, Air Chief Marshal Arjun Singh, at a ripe old age of 50, retired from the service. He handed over to Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal, who was 53 when he took over, and also they both fought together in Burma, and they were well known to each other. P.C. Lal had just come back because after the 65 war, where he was the vice chief, he had been sent off to streamline a lot of the projects in HAL, that is the manufacturing line for the Type 77, the manufacturing line for the HS-748. So he was back after a 5-year hiatus from the Air Force. 1.5 months later, Noor Khan, the famous Noor Khan of 65 war, handed over to Air Marshal Abdul Rahim Khan, who served under P.C. Lal in 7th Squadron Flying Vengeances in Burma. He was also fairly well regarded. He was married to an Indian princess of Ranpur, and he himself was from Lucknow. So he was also fairly well regarded. These changes were to have game-changing impacts on the way the 71 war would be fought. So off the radars, as you know, after 62 war, the US gave us 6 of the Star Sapphire series of radars. In the west, you can see one was in Delhi, one was Barnala, and there were another about, I don't know if it can be seen clearly, about 30 radars of P-30 class that we moved up north, right up from Jammu, we moved to Pathankot. I think it's not very clear here. And all the airfields down south, we had one at Fazilka, one at Faridkot, one at Abohar, and all the airfields, we moved radars from Surya Lanka, etc. in the east to bring them forward. Mainly all the P-30s. This chart shows the Pakistanis basically had two sector operation centers. The one in the north was an ANTPS-1, which was Sakesar at a height of 5,000 feet. It could see all the way east up to the border. And one at a place called Korangi Creek, which was Drig Road in the south, just outside Karachi. And of course, there was a large number of the Marconi radars, which were based at several high features next to Sakesar in the north, you can see, and in the Shakargarh Bulge at Muridke and just behind Lahore. These were radars that during the war would be hunted extensively for by the Su-7s. And of course, one was at Rafiqi, one at Multan, then one at Khairpur, just north of Ramyar Khan, one at Jacobabad, then south of that, one at Nawab Shah, and of course, right at the bottom, there's one at Badin and a place called Pir Patho, which was on a hill on the Indus Delta. We, of course, had the SAM-2s. As you can see, they were defending Agra, they were defending New Delhi, they were defending Samalkha, just south of Chandigarh, and north, place called Mullapur. We had moved up SAM-2s to protect Halwara, and we had moved up one at a place called Jhandu, I think Jhandu Kala, just north of Adampur. So this was one asymmetry that we had, and it had a major impact on the Pakistan Air Force. In the east, of course, we had the Star Sapphire radar at Shillong, and we had radars at a place called Zafarpur, north of Barakpur, one at Bagdogra on the north, then at Tezpur, and the one at Misamari had shifted south here at Teliamora. And the Pakistanis had moved one P-30 from Dhaka west to Malir, just north of Karachi, and they had one P-35 left, which was located in the Dhaka Zoo. And this could never be found by the Air Force. We tried very hard. It was well camouflaged inside the zoo. So anti-aircraft artillery, this was where the Pakistanis were far superior to us. We still had World War II L-60, L-70 guns. We had one regiment each. The Pakistanis had, as you can see, we had 9 AD regiments and also 9 of the TA battalions with only L-60, L-70 guns. And Pakistan Air Force had 12 AD regiments, L-60, the new 37mm Chinese guns, which could go up to 4,000 feet, very high rate of fire, and most importantly, the 14.5mm 4-barrel gun. And as the war would show, the Indian Air Force would lose 24 aircraft to ground fire in the west and 8 over Dhaka itself. Just the airfield itself, we lost 8 aircraft. While if you see, Pakistan Air Force only lost 5. And 1 aircraft to small arm fire, where one soldier from Kumaon regiment, he used a light machine gun, a handheld light machine gun, to shoot down the MiG-19. So what did the PAF add after 1965 war? They had about 4 C-130s from the map earlier. They got 2 civil C-130s from PIA. They bought 5 more from the US, ex-map, and the Iranian Air Force gave them 4, which they never returned after the war. They had only 8 F-104s left from 14, and the Royal Jordanian Air Force would give them 10 more on the 13th of December, which they would use from Karachi. They bought 120 F-86E Sabres from Germany. This was second hand, and of course 90 F-6s. These were the 2 new aircraft that they got. I mean, one of them was actually second hand, and most importantly, 24 Mirages, 3 DP, RP, these were the trainer and reconnaissance versions. So Indian Air Force basically only got 90 Su-7s, 120 MiG-21s, 32 Maruts. We bought 58 more Hunters, which is second hand, 28 more Canberras, 70 new Nats more, and transport types, as you can see, we added a large number, but we will not discuss that. So I don't know if you can see this clearly, this is not large enough. But basically, this is what the sorties that we flew. I will go directly to what were the sorties and the utilization and what was the attrition rate. So if you see from the top, the number of aircraft is what was serviceable. Surprisingly, the Indian Air Force average serviceability throughout the war was only 63%, while Pakistan Air Force was in excess of 75%. So if you see the Nats, 53 aircraft, 1,116 sorties, mainly what I'm trying to show is that the percentage, the maximum flying was done by the MiG-21, that is at 28%. Its utilization was 1.3 sorties per aircraft per day, and its attrition, that means how many aircraft lost per 100 sorties, 7 losses and 0.44 was the attrition rate. So the highest, as you can see, was the Marut, 2.3 aircraft lost per 100 sorties, but this was basically because it flew only 127 sorties. If you see the Pakistanis, the highest was the B-57, once again because it only flew 18 sorties. And the Mirages, of course, there was no loss. So ultimately, the Indian Air Force used its aircraft for 1 sortie per day per aircraft. The Pakistanis used it only for 0.93, and used it only for 0.93. Attrition rate was 1.01 for the Indian Air Force, slightly higher than the Pakistan Air Force, but we, as you can see, flew more than double than Pakistan Air Force. So yes, the IAF was superior in numbers, there's no doubt. Technology was equal, except the fact we had SAM-2s. Their Sidewinders were 1 generation further from our Ka-13s. We had the S-24, but it came very late in the war. We could use it only in the last 6 days of the war. Both sides had no anti-runway or anti-tank weapons. We were only using rockets and guns against the tanks. Pak ESM, their F-104, 2 of them were modified to find radars, and they were using these F-104s to find our radars. Fortunately, we shot them down on the 2nd day of the war, and the IAF Canberras were unable to carry out dive attacks like the Pakistani aircraft could. So the accuracy was not very good. They were releasing from 7,000 feet at night. So achievement against airfields was not as expected. All the Sus, all the MiGs, very short legs. They had very little fuel to go to reach the target, and then, if required, to fight on the way back. There was absolutely no fuel. And escorts we started using only halfway through the war. That is why attrition in the beginning of the war was quite high, and we overexposed ourselves in close air support. We continued to carry out many missions, many passes, low level, low speed attacks. Maximum losses were in the TBA. Surprisingly, the Pakistan Air Force balanced this by simply not flying. They said we will wait and conserve our aircraft when the Pakistani 1 corps was planned to make a breakout in the area of Bahawalpur, which never happened. By the 10th of December, we knew that it won't happen, but Pakistan Air Force refused to fly and support their army like they did in, let's say, Longewala. They just refused to support their own army. As you can see, only 288 counter-air sorties, that was only 6% of the entire air fort, and only 23 interdiction sorties. That is only 0.7% of the entire air effort. So they did not cross the IB. They did not want to expose themselves to Indian anti-aircraft fire. So given the force asymmetry, there was no doubt who would win the war. It was only how soon we could win it and how we would win it. So I think both sides, like the chief said, were well matched in the West, 245 to 215. Maximum losses, like I said, was because we made overzealous multiple pass attacks in the TBA. Most interceptions were over TBA. We lost a lot of aircraft there. And since there were no offensive objectives in the West, it was only a holding war, it became a slugging match. So our attrition became more than theirs because they never crossed the IB. But the Indian Air Force's ground attack saved the day at Cham, at Suleimanki, at Hussainiwala, at Chakargarh, and of course Longewala. And ultimately, the IAF flew 94% more sorties than the PAF and suffered 111% more in terms of losses. So this was the impact of the numbers. I have finished. I'm sorry, I've overshot my time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. And I now request Air Marshal Chaudhary to take the floor.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I won't take too much of time with the introduction because we are already behind time. And I just want to say a few things in the beginning, is that, when I grew up as a youngster, and a lot of our generation will endorse that, we actually grew up bereft of heroes, despite them being there all around us in Air Force. And that's because we just didn't know what all had happened in the wars. And I'm glad, at least before I hang my flying boots up today, I'm today in the presence of, I would say, legends. And simply put, that's why I'm terrified of the debrief which is going to follow later. I will just quickly cover where so I will not waste too much of time. I'll just get down to the facts. Operational approach of this and the psyche of the Pakistan Air Force. Famous words of Pushpinder Singh and the book Fizaya, which was actually the first time we ever got to read something on what a PAF pilot was all about. I'll just quickly run through my topic under the following heads. And so the first is living in the Army's shadow. The first CNC, AVM Perikeen, who was a part of the Armed Forces Reconstitution Committee, he actually set the pace for the Pakistani Air Force. And unlike the Indian Air Force, the differential of rank in the Pakistani Air Force when it was formed was immense. The senior most was that time Group Captain Janjua, who was the first SOA. And the next senior most after that was Asghar Khan, who turned up as the 5th chief, and he was a mere wing commander at that point in time. So there was, why I'm saying this seniority differential is important, because it led to something subsequently. In the beginning, there was this huge spat between the Army CNC and the Air Force CNC, that is Sir Douglas Gracie, who after the Korean War wrote a paper, and in which he commented, they said the small Pakistani Air Force should be trained primarily for tactical support of the Pakistan Army and Navy, and be equipped to carry out this task with suitable aircraft. Obviously, that set the cat among the pigeons, and actually promptly replied, I'm not inferring that you don't know your job, I'm saying that you don't know mine. Air must be left to the airmen, even Monty preaches that. And in fact, I haven't put it here, but he continued to say that I feel we are playing only lip service to the joint service planning when you issue a paper on air strategy without any formal reference to your colleagues. Ironical and uncanny similarities. The first round in which Asghar Singh, I beg your pardon, Air Marshal Asghar Khan wrote in his memoirs, he said that, PAF had a very clear understanding that the PAF role was air battle, that it cannot be a main role, it could not be diverted from till achievement of the primary aim, and could only provide limited close support at any time, which the Army should treat it as a bonus. So coming from this, and he also firmly believed that his president understood little of air operations, preferred Air Force as an arm of the Army, an airborne platform on airborne artillery, whose role should be to clear the way for the infantry and the armor. To which obviously General Musa at that point in time had his own views. He in fact wrote a book, My Version, Indo-Pak War 1965. And he said, consequently in training and operational planning of the Army, it was assumed that air support would not be forthcoming to the extent that Army's main counter-offensive was planned without any air support. This is in 65. So why we go back there? Because fundamentally the difference in the perception of the role of the PAF and the divide with the Army was evident right from the 65 war. It kept the Pak Army out of the loop. In fact, even the 1947 part of the operations was not even known. I beg your pardon, the Kashmir, the second phase of war, which was in Kashmir in 1965, was not known to the PAF chief. There was a fait accompli acceptance that air battle was the main role of the PAF, and the inter-service divide in the senior military leadership and absence of absolute any joint planning. But PAF has been effective in building both the wars, 65 and 71, into a myth of Indian misadventure, where it defeated by a numerically inferior but professionally superior and aggressive PAF. This is what they firmly believed. And unfortunately, in the absence of official records with Pakistan and with us, and the partisan writings of many, and obviously the pro-Pakistan Western strategic and academic practitioner community, which it was very firmly at 65 and 71, we got a very skewed version of the wars. And this unfortunately, this misperception remained. Fundamentally, their approach was a tactical offensive strategy based on preemptive strike on Air Force bases, reduce the numerical superiority, equitable balance of air power, prevent surprise attack, presumption was it was not a contingency, and 6 enemy forward airfields and 3 radars were struck 15 minutes before dusk. This is what set off the whole premise for the preemptive strikes, which subsequently kept coming on. So the PAF counter-strike, actually, we are all aware, followed much later, actually, and it was not really preemptive, because finally it happened on the 6th, despite the plannings. It commenced 15 days later from the original plans. Strikes were not launched as per the plan, and the failure of the preemptive strategic offensive on the 6th of September was no less than a debacle, especially considering that the PAF operational readiness was at the optimum with missions fully rehearsed. This is what Sajjad Nauzi Haider, the formation leader of the famous Pathankot strike, has to say in his book. So basically, the PAF has been used as smaller size effectively in its history, creating the image of a heroic David fighting against a larger Goliath and emerging victorious. In fact, the PAF official history states that the IF plane came in waves with numerical edge of 5:1, and the Indians took a well-calculated risk. IF aircraft, we are all aware, at that point in time on the west was 290 aircraft, which included 80 Mysteers and 48 Vampires, and PAF had 187 aircraft in the west. The actual ratio was only 1.55:1 on the western front in 1965. They came in waves. This obviously negates the whole narrative which they have that they had air superiority. The fact that if we could go across in waves, it sort of sabotaged their own narrative. And took a well-calculated risk. This is when he talks about the IF. It obviously highlights the courage of the Indian pilots who flew often to the limits of the ROA, and it was brought out by my previous speaker, combat endurance, and in a cap-intensive environment. So despite superior technology, advanced inventory, and the claimed superiority by PAF pilots in training and motivation, the IF pilots displayed better air combat performance. This is our Ekmona Judge Singh's words. So effectively, I will not go to the details, but the fact is that PAF claimed it had air supremacy, which was absolutely a myth. And in fact, we flew almost close to 4,000 sorties, of which almost 2,000 sorties were offensive, and multiple parts, which was brought out in the extremes of ROA, whereas PAF flew 1,300 cap sorties out of their total of less than 2,500 sorties, which is about 55% was AD. And 15 IF air combat losses. So if you look at and match up the amount of effort IF has put up, there was enough evidence of IF combat persistence in the absence of PAF air supremacy, which they claimed. And as Air Vice Marshal Tony Mason has put it, in the war between India and Pakistan, air superiority was never contested. Now we come to 71, which is where we come from 65. What are the key drivers of PAF strategy? Obviously, the belief that East Pakistan could not be threatened as long as India was in a dilemma of that any attack on the western border would force us to split our forces, and we wouldn't have problems engaging both wings simultaneously. So the strategy of defense of East Pakistan was reciprocal counterattack by West Pakistan. Pakistan could not separate forces for the two wings, obviously not adequate resources, and obviously could not choose the time and place of the war. So this was a constraint which PAF faced. Force levels precluded offensive, and we saw the number crunching brought out by Air Marshal Vikram Singh. And so intensive ground support was ruled out without air superiority, which was a no-brainer. So the only viable option which PAF had was fundamentally destroy IAF over Pakistan skies, a la Battle of Britain. Situation permitting, launch offensive. So what are the key drivers of PAF planning? They had a limited number of Mirage 3s, which obviously they didn't have enough depth of penetration. So we'll see later that the fighters were pretty much kept out of depth sorties. Removal of Bengalis from the PAF led to shortages in the air crew versus ground crew. There's one anecdote I'll mention here. In fact, I think it was Air Commodore Zafar, who was the first PAF commander on the Eastern PAF AOC. He was removed because he refused to undertake operations against the in East Bengal. He was replaced by Imamul Haq, Air Commodore Imamul Haq, and there were two drivers which came into being. One was, that is the time where Rahim Yar Khan, Air Marshal Rahim Yar Khan, was pretty upset with the Bengalis for the fundamental fact that is when Matiur Rahman's escape attempt happened with the pilot of some Minars, in which crashed. That was one incident which was a big serious issue, which was taken very seriously when the Bengali pilot tried to wrestle controls and fly the aircraft to India. Second instance was 20 MOF personnel of the PAF were slaughtered in Mymensingh jail. So this is something which the PAF chief could not take, and it set him off probably. But so all the Bengalis were removed from, despite, and led to aircrew and ground crew shortages. MiG-29 assigned in AD and CAS roles only, were not modified for air-to-air missiles, and limited ROA. Concept of close air support not received enough attention. It's an old legacy. And the story of PAF actually records close air support as only a vague option for the PAF. PAF's established satellite bases did not have adequate asset for the air defense in the forward range of satellite bases, and limited presence had to force them to dissipate the meager resources, so they chose to defend the depth bases more carefully. Limited inventory obviated any major role knowing the designs of the enemy, and once losses were natural. So basically, they found it too high a risk to come too deep into the Indian sides. Enemy ground moves are known. Indian army was much larger. It could open any number of fronts. Thus, the PAF felt severely constrained in its planning. And more importantly, the Pakistan government's military war policy and objectives were not clearly known. So it assumed offensive defense role. Self-preservation was a high priority with PAF. Prepared for an elusive war which dimensions were not known, it adopted a defensive war strategy instead of and with steady offensive probes. It adopted a policy of survival against all odds in an hostile air environment. And the East Pakistan element of PAF was pretty much left on its own, like 1965, as it hoped to tilt the tables in the West. So in counter-air, we know IF was well defended post-1965. We had learned, it was brought out very amply, we had learned our lessons well. Strikes to forward airfields were restricted. It was only to provoke retaliation so that IAF would come in and into the PAF territory where they could be engaged and shot down, like Battle of Britain pretty much. Depth airfields, Indian depth airfields will be taken on by the bombers at night. And offensive strategy-wise, Tikka Khan's grand strategy of the 2 corps, which was brought out, which never took place, didn't really happen. But there was a very interesting aspect attached to it. The estimate, this was war-gamed, this offensive, and the estimated cost of this commitment to PAF was done in July 1971, and a loss of 100 to 200 combat aircraft and pilots were expected likely over 7 days. This is what PAF's analysis was. And Air Marshal Rahim Khan was aware that this would amount to losing 1/3 of his air force and had support of his senior commanders when he directed them to prepare their units accordingly in August to ensure success of the Pakistan Army's offensive. Now, this is very interesting. Finally, once they agreed on the D-Day, that they're convinced that to coincide the strikes on the 3rd of December, air superiority was planned in the form of an umbrella over this famous Tikka Khan's thrust, which it would be a moving umbrella of air superiority, and subsequently provide cover to the Pak Army once they're dug in. Close support, laying its limited resources and endangering multi-million-dollar aircraft for destroying tanks and weapons was not acceptable till the main offensive. This is an assessment from a ex-PAF pilot who's written PAF, to maintain pressure with sustained strikes against IF forward bases and rear bases, to inhibit IAF's offensive air support, interdiction, and counter air strikes. The idea was to keep the airfields bothered and busy so that they couldn't launch. And PAF would provide air support needed for Pakistan Army's holding actions. And as far as they were supposed to provide air support to the Navy, which frankly, the capability was near zero. Now let's get on to the psyche of the PF pilot. Where do they come from? Famous quote of Pushpinder Singh, I won't repeat it. But interestingly, PAF pilots had flown in Algeria, Egypt, a whole lot of countries before the war. And they had a vast amount of experience, and in the words of Kaiser Tufail, he mentions that Indian pilots gained, PAF pilots gained extensive experience on wide range of fighters, including the NAT, the Hunter, the MiG-21 FL/M, and the Su-7. First-hand knowledge about adversary aircraft, as well as well-honed flying skills of the PAF pilots, were key factors in their remarkable performance during various conflicts, unquote. PAF essentially maintains a skill-based posting to fighters and a young age profile for squadron commanders. Squadron commanders mandatorily undergo the Flight Leader School, which was instituted by Asghar Khan in 1958 and now called the CCS, or the Combat Commander School. The senior-most air marshal does not necessarily get to be the chief. On the contrary, the exception has been the rule. In addition, the martial race stereotype, the ascendancy of a superior combat pilot, and is a part of the PAF grooming. And as Pushpinder Singh says, there is little doubt as to which of the prime air arms of the Indian subcontinent is more conscious of its importance of image building and intelligent public relations. The PAF has many friends and admirers amongst the world's aerospace media, not the least because of its sustained effort to put its best wing forward. The PAF has innumerable articles, features, books written about it, covered by international writers, journalists, photographers. This boosts the morale. So what happened in the final outcome? The breakdown was given. I will not go into the details. The daily average flown by PAF was about 201 sorties. The unpublished official MOD report confirms about 44 confirmed kills and 6 probable PAF losses in the west, and 19 Sabres and 3 T-33s in the east. 10 lost in air combat, 9 Sabres and T-33 written off post-capture. Whereas Tufail claims, Kaiser Tufail claims, there were only 27 aircraft. He's given the tail numbers and the locations in his book were lost. He says 22 aircraft were lost in the west and 5 in the east. So in the absence of reliable assessment, and this remains a gray area. So the PAF operations in the east was essentially a heroic struggle, as it is put in the history, and which it was, and in a no-win situation. On the west, PAF history states that the IAF counter-air had no operational effect, as it lost a large number of aircraft to the hot reception by the PAF cap. In view of the large area of surface operations, it was impossible for PAF to commit completely to ground support. History, and this pretty much seems like actually a sort of excuses for the situation. But very interesting, the history covers up IAF strategic strikes on oil and power facilities as bombardments on civilian areas of Lahore and Karachi, and it was underplayed. It admits that IAF attacks in support of the Indian Army and Pakistan lines of communication were well performed. Finally, in the end, I think the PAF managed to stick to its aim of defense and preserving its fighting capability, which has been in their psyche right from '65. And this is what Sajjad Haider had to say, that unlike the realistic planning and execution by the PAF, planning at the highest tiers of national and army leadership, including Pakistan and the general headquarters, was intrinsically flawed, to say the least, not launching the punch of the army, the #1 Armored Corps, and the senseless assault by an unprepared force without air cover against Ramgarh in the south, hoping to capture Jaisalmer in a blitzkrieg, was an amazing blunder which caused incalculable loss of precious lives and equipment. Some end thoughts.
Sure.
So essentially, most of the PAF narrative has been built around its few successes in counter-air. This is probably because preponderance of air defense, which is the psyche of the PAF. It has a history of reticence of supporting its army operations, which is reciprocated by inadequate understanding of air power amongst its generals. Very interesting parallels. It tends to dissociate itself from the legacy of military defeats, which attributes the army to have been defeated, and that the Air Force has actually won the war and saved Pakistan from total destruction. But in the end, I will only conclude by saying that since military victory is not a bean count of inventory losses, but one of outcomes and achievements of national objectives. It is time to put some myths to rest. I think in the final outcome, the PA for the adversary was not 10 feet tall, but most certainly a worthy foe. With that, I have finished. Thank you. This is interesting. This is a painting of, I think, which is claimed to be Flight Lieutenant Atik shooting down Squadron Leader Jiva Singh. Oops, sorry. I'm sorry, sir. I think I'll leave it here, sir. Okay.
Thank you, Chow. Arjun, thank you.
Can somebody just help me with this, please? Former chiefs, distinguished veterans and senior officers, DG caps, air warriors, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be able to offer some perspectives this morning on what I liken to a chessboard. And why do I say a chessboard? Because every air power move in 1971, if you look at it chronologically and the impact that it had on the overall trajectory of the conflict and the final fall of Dhaka, looks like a game of chess, with every move being more impactful than the previous. And why do I have this particular photograph as my opening slide? Because I would reckon that this operation, which is the series of reconnaissance missions in November conducted by 37 Squadron, marks the opening chess move of air power in the 1971 war. And its impact on ground operations as we went along is often understated, because the kind of mosaic that it provided ground commanders like never before. I mean to say, this was a fledgling area that was not operationally exploited, which is photo reconnaissance tactically. And particularly General Sagat Singh benefited immensely from those several sorties that were flown from 37 Squadron deep inside East Pakistan, developed at times in Agartala, handed over photographs to General Sagat Singh's corps headquarters, and then got back to Guwahati. So this is a photograph of Wing Commander Supi Kaul with Flying Officer Masand and Group Captain Wallen, probably last minute looking at the maps to ensure that they go into the right place.
That's the AOC Diwan.
Oh, sorry. Okay, my correction. Right. So what I'm going to do is that through a series of 8 operations that took place over less than 2 weeks, I want to highlight the disproportionate impact of the Indian Air Force in particular and air power in general, because the INS Vikrant will also figure towards the end of my talk, and its impact on the capitulation of Dhaka on the 16th. So I will look at the Boira battle, gaining air superiority by putting Tezgah out of operation, interdiction that followed at places like Jamalpur, Hilli, Narayanganj, Joydevpur, the Sylhet battle, which is often underestimated and has been not spoken of as important as it ought to have been. The Meghna heli bridge, the Tangel drop, the strike on the governor's house, and finally INS Vikrant in operation. So what do we all remember about the Boira battle? We remember the Boira battle as this fantastic aerial action that took place over Boira, in which 2 sabres were shot by this bunch of 4 hotshot Indian Air Force fighter pilots. But what we don't amalgamate into the Boira battle is the fact that while the air battle was going on over the Boira Bulge, there was an equally fierce ground battle going on below, which is known as the Battle of Garibpur. And in the Battle of Garibpur, one Indian Army battalion supported by a squadron of tanks was facing an entire Pakistani Army brigade and a squadron of tanks. On the 21st of November, the Indian Army faced a fair amount of air action in the form of sabres. And there was a talk on the ground, where is the Indian Air Force? And rightly so, war had not yet been declared. So there would have been some amount of trepidation to allow the Indian fighters to go into East Pakistan. But nevertheless, next day, 2 attempts were made by 22 Squadron to intercept the Sabres who were causing some amount of chaos over the TBA. And in that second attempt on 22nd, we had this formation of 4 Nats pouncing on some careless bit of flying by the Pakistani Air Force Sabres. Like Vikram mentioned, repeated passes over the, over the Boira Bulge, and they caught them and 2 Sabres were shot down, one of whom later on became the chief of the Pakistani Air Force. So when you look at the Boira battle, you also need to look at the fact that it was actually accompanying an equally fierce ground battle that was going on, which is the first reported legitimate army action that took place in East Pakistan. And that was 14 Punjab supported by 45 cavalry. Now, if you look at it, the map again conveys a lot. You have these 2 set of maps which will give you an idea as to the kind of effort that was put in vertical envelopment and literal psychological coercion using air power from all directions. So, if you let me spend a minute on this map. If you look at the map, you actually have 2 corps moving in from the west and a corps moving in from the east. You had 33 Corps and you had 2 Corps and you had 101 communication zone coming in from the north. And you had 4 Corps commanded by General Sagat Singh moving in from the from the east. And if you look at it, 9 fighter squadrons supported by 3 helicopter units, all of them in support primarily to ensure a psychological capitulation on part of the Pakistani forces. Okay, what was the next piece in the chessboard? The next piece on the chessboard was how do you put Tezgaon out of action? Now, surprisingly, for the first couple of days, the Indian Air Force didn't get its act together as to how better, what was the weapon combination to be used in order to get to put Tezgaon out of action. And this is something that Flight Lieutenant Manbir from 28th Squadron has spent a long time with me mentioning as to how on the 5th, they finally went and experimented with steep dive attacks and 500 kg bombs at Kurmitola. And after having seen, now if you look at it, the right-hand side depicts left-hand side is Kurmitola Airfield on 5th, and the right craterization was 1 day later on the 6th by 28th Squadron at Tezgaon Airfield. So clearly it was thinking on your feet. There weren't plans in place as to what is the weapon to be used to put Tezgaon out of action, and it evolved over a hit and trial basis of 2 days of operations in which there was some amount of opposition from the Sabres. So the next piece, the next move on the chessboard was, because Tezgaon was put out of action, extensive interdiction operations could be carried out by the Indian Air Force, by the Sioux, by the Hunters, by even Canberras. Extensive operations in the north, supporting the Battle of Hilli, at Jamalpur and at Akhoda. Now, all these operations were taking place simultaneously. And now we are around the 6th and the 7th of December. Now, that's the Narayanganj port which was hit by Hunters as well as Canberras. And on the left is the Joydepur ammunition factory that was put out of action. Now, we move to the next piece of the puzzle, and here on the screen are 2 of the architects of the Meghna Heli Bridge, the Sylhet operations and the Sylhet operations. You have General Sagat Singh and you have Group Captain Chandan Singh. And you have a conference on the banks of the river Meghna as to what to do ahead with Sagat, Chandan and his divisional commanders. Now we are 7th December. Tezgaon out of action, no enemy air effort above, but it required some quick thinking and understanding of air power to be able to exploit the kind of air assets that were available with General Sagat Singh. And that is when he decided that how do you isolate several garrisons and prevent them from reinforcing Dhaka in a couple of days. And the first thing was when 8th Mountain Division 4x5 Gorkhas was asked to assault Sylhet, 1 battalion against a brigade plus. And how did they do it? They did it with the help of helicopters from 105, 110 and 111 HU. A battalion was heli-lifted to the outskirts of Sylhet, and the rest is history, wherein they held off a brigade, 1 battalion, supported by Flight Lieutenant Sharma, who was the FAC and NATS, carrying out close air support on a regular basis. Now, emboldened by the success of the Sylhet operations, what General Sagat did what General Sagat did was preparing to cross the Meghna River. And this was with 57 Mountain Division, Ben Gonsalves and his forces in 3 waves, or in several waves, 350 sorties spread out between 9th and 12th of December, heli-lifted more than a brigade, or rather closer to 2 brigade worth of troops into 3 positions, Brahmanbaria, Narsingdi, and further south, giving an impression to Niazi that there was a para brigade that was dropped north, and there was an entire division that was enveloped on the, to the east and the south. And these are a couple of photographs of the Mi force taking off in several waves and unloading on the other side of the river Meghna. Again, the Mi force transported artillery, and the first guns that boomed into Dhaka belonged to 57 Infantry Division, thanks to 105 and 110 HU. Now, if you look at so now we are positioned at about 12th December, and on 11th was the Tangel drop, a drop that was originally planned as a brigade but scaled down to a little bit over a battalion because it was felt that multiple waves would not be safe, and that it was possible to cause the same kind of psychological impact with a battalion plus rather than an entire brigade. And seeing is actually believing, so I will play a short video clip next.
To cut off Pakistani forces headed for Dhaka on the 11th of December was another defining moment of the war. It was the Indian Army's biggest airborne operation yet, involving 700 paratroopers being airdropped in the rear of the Pakistani forces. The sky was full of parachutes, and the aircraft was flying wave after wave, dropping the paratroopers, recalls one Indian paratrooper. Pakistani soldiers, however, mistake the Indian paratroopers for the desperately awaited Chinese soldiers they were expecting, and there is a brief moment of jubilation before the crushing realization that they were indeed Indians. To make matters worse for the Pakistanis, foreign news agency broadcasts erroneously reported that about 5,000 paratroopers had been dropped in this area, which further unnerved Lieutenant General Niazi at Dhaka. In fact, Niazi sent a frantic message to the Chief of General Staff of Pakistan saying, enemy heli-dropped approximately 1 brigade south of Narsingdi and landed 1 para-brigade in the Tangail area. Request friends arrive Dhaka by air first flight 12th December.
These friends are the Chinese.
The march of Indian paratroopers from Tangail to Dhaka and
Okay. Now, before another piece in the puzzle is the impact of INS Vikrant in blockading East Pakistan and contributing overall through the medium of air to the complete capitulation of East Pakistan. Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, Khulna, Chalna were all the ports that were riverine and the coastal ports that were hit from INS Vikrant, apart from sinking a fair number of boats and shipping that took place. Now, so therefore the puzzle doesn't end there. The final blow was obviously the strike on the governor's house by Hunters and MiG-21s. Now, the fact of the matter is that even the army acknowledges, and particularly General Shami Mehta says that if there was a game-changing event in Bangladesh, it was the strike on the governor's house, a seemingly tactical action that had strategic effects. And that strategic effect was the surrender of was throwing in the towel both by the governor as well as the martial law administrator. I will sort of end with another video, and this time, again, seeing is believing. We keep hearing about the MiG-21s streaking over Dhaka, but here is a
Indian planes rocket attacked Dhaka's military installations. The panic-stricken governor of East Bengal resigns. An eyewitness report by a British journalist.
I got there after the first raid on the governor's
That's
house.
Mark Tully.
Were half destroyed with the residents. Then I got there just after that. I found the governor in the bunker, in the guard, trembling like a leaf and saying, I didn't quite know whether to resign. Should I resign? Will my wife be killed by the Indian Army? Can I get at the Intercontinental Hotel? As we were standing there in this bunker, suddenly there was another raid. And all hell broke loose.
And all hell broke loose. There was another raid and all hell broke loose.
The crash died down, but the governor suddenly produced a ballpoint pen, scrap of paper, a few carbons, and had written out a resignation statement in a matter of seconds, just in time actually for the second big crash.
The noose around Dhaka is drawn tighter with the help of the Indian Air Force's helicopters. It takes 72 hours for the helicopters to put enough men behind Pakistani lines to capture Sylhet. Now the choppers drop troops onto the very outskirts of Dhaka. The engineers of the Indian Army provide instant mobility by building bridges as fast as the Pakistanis can blow them up.
Okay. So, quickly summing up in 30 seconds, if you look at it, that each one of these operations that I've spoken about in brief were pieces on a chessboard. And each move was more impactful than the previous one. And therefore, if somebody says that air operations did not play a pivotal role in the collapse of Dhaka, then I think they're speaking through their hat. And secondly, anyone who says that the operations were not planned or that they were planned by thinking on their feet also need to take a rethink and go back into history. Because whether they were pre-planned or whether they were planned by operational commanders thinking on the ground, it was a plan that came into place, and it was a plan that involved air power weaving into the overall concept of operations. This was actually jointmanship in its best, may not be institutionalized, may be personality driven, but I think it offers significant markers and is very instructive even in the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arjun. May I now request Group Captain Shamsul Alam to be brought online? Technical support. Shamsul? Where? No, where's Shamsul? Oh, okay. Yeah. So please, will you get him online? Oh, while he's coming on, ladies and gentlemen, to just save time when you get on, let me just sum up or bring some points to your notice as the chair. I'm very thankful to all the, and as I said, very illustrious speakers who gave us their insights and gave us the historical background in addition to the 71 war, which sets the stage correctly. And as you notice, they have so much to say that in the enthusiasm they overran the time also, of course. So that's why I want to compress the time now so that we have adequate time for the audience to ask questions later. But I'm very thankful to them for bringing out all the nitty-gritty and the background to the entire, or the context of the 1971 war and the detailed operations that they brought about. Basically, as you would notice from all that has been said, the details are in their chapters in the book, and I would recommend all the younger people, particularly, and even the veterans of 71 to pick up a copy of this book and read through the details far more than what they've been given time for to express over here. But if you notice from these talks today from our part, particularly in the East, there were three major pillars for the entire victory, or the Blitzkrieg, or the lightning campaign that we called. The first and the most important of these, in my opinion, for which we haven't paid adequate emphasis, was air supremacy, complete mastery of the skies over the East and the Bay of Bengal, which actually permitted the surface forces, both the Army and the Navy, to operate with impunity at the time and place of their choosing, and therefore fashion the victory. Actually, it was this supremacy that permitted very aggressive and innovative people like General Sagat, the true hero of this, in coordination with Group Captain Chandan Singh, to grab the opportunity and mount the operations across the Meghna that Arjun very succinctly brought out. As a matter of fact, I don't think any of these operations, the first lifting of the 4x5 GR Gurkha Regiment to contain Sylhet, was planned before this, and it actually came on the fly, on the run. And Sagat used the opportunity because he had been, shall I say, he had been commander of the Para Brigade earlier during Goa operations, and therefore he, as Air Chief Lal in his book also pays compliment to him, he understood the intricacies of air power and how to utilize it to further his own objectives and aim on them. So I would say he was very largely responsible for the lightning campaign and the surrender at Dhaka, the second factor that we are talking about. The third, obviously, was he was supported by the para drop of 2 para at Tangail, led by a very flamboyant commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pannu, that Arjun has written about. You should read about the history of this Colonel Pannu and how he rose later. But once again, without waiting for actually linking up with the major forces and the others, Pannu decided to march on to Dhaka from the north. So that's how he surrounded Dhaka and led to the capitulation later. The coup de grace naturally was, in my opinion, the attack on the government house. Air Marshal Bishnoi is right here, who led the attack from the MiG side, and of course 4 hunters from I Squadron 37 in Hasimara. Now we all went in somewhere around there, and that's what led to the immediate surrender signing by by Mr. Malik, who was the governor at that time. This attack was followed, which has not been mentioned here, by another attack on the university area on the 15th, the next day, where the army was supposed to be, the Pakistani army was supposed to be hiding, as per intelligence reports, actually literally conveying the message that you can run, but you can't hide, we'll get you. And that's what, facilitated the surrender and General Jacob to be able to fly across and force this unconditional surrender on General Niazi, who was commanding the Pakistani forces in the east. So this is how I would sum up. And if Shamsul is in, is he there? You could kindly put him on for his reflections. If you haven't been able to get him, then can we throw the house open for questions? Because we only got 20 minutes left. 5 minutes? So let's have the first question either from the audience or online or whoever. Sir, Kapil sir, you have a question, please?
Thank you very much. I don't have a question, but a very brief comment resulting from 2 observations, one by Marshal Chowdhury, the other by A.V.M. Subramaniam, on the army air cooperation on the Pakistani side, and linked perhaps with the personality factor. And I can share a personal experience which reinforces what Chow said, of meeting Air Chief Marshal Asghar Khan in his home in Islamabad about a decade ago, and had taken the air attaché there so that whatever he says duly gets conveyed to air headquarters. And what he told me is of great interest. It highlights the point that the top Air Force leadership must have unhindered and total access to the political leadership. Why do I say this? What Asghar Khan told me in the 2.5-hour discussion I had in his house was that he had problems with Musa, and he said 65, whatever mischief the Pakistanis were up to, he opposed it and told Ayub Khan that it will be a disaster for Pakistan. And he also told me, and this is for record, that in 1971 too, once again he met Yahya Khan, by which time, as you know, as everyone here knows, he was removed as the Chief of Air Staff of Pakistan Air Force in April 1965, and a more pliable Air Marshal Noor Khan was brought in. In 71, he said, I once again went to Yahya Khan and told him there is a disaster lurking in the air. He better propose some political arrangement with East Pakistan, then East Pakistan. Interestingly, he also mentioned that, and this is corroborated by Kaiser Tufail in his book, that the Pakistan Air Force is completely out of picture even for the first briefing on Kargil in 1999. So this is of interest primarily to us today, and if Chao or Arjun would like to comment, we are going to 65 and 71 and 99. Has there been any positive change for the better in that area of coordination and cooperation between the Pakistan Army and the Pakistan Air Force? I'd be grateful for that.
I just have endorsed a few your comments, sir. Is that in fact when Air Marshal Noor Khan took over, and General Musa, he had this to say of General Noor Khan. He says, he altered Asgar's concept and rightly decided that ground support was also an important function which the PAF should take on besides its main commitment. So this is something which Musa said, and interestingly, Noor Khan, I mean, there's no connection maybe to this whatsoever, was an army officer's son. So there was this huge understanding probably, and which probably bridged the divide. But very rightly brought out that this divide has continued, and I think, I forget her name, this is Pakistani author, she's written on Kargil, book on Kargil, Nasim Zehra. She says this, it's recorded in the book that the PAF chief and the Navy chief were brought on board only when things began to unravel, and the PAF chief, Pak chief, army chief wanted the air to come in, and which was turned down by the PAF chief. I mean, he advised against it in Kargil. So this continues, and there's a RAND study, I think way much later, I think in the middle of 2000s, which clearly states that the Pakistani Air Force, while it's presumably an independent Air Force, its policy decisions and final directions are on the approval of the Army Chief. And that is how it is still today.
Boop sir, we'll come back to your question. I think Shamsul has come online, so I'll come back to your questions. Okay. Welcome, Shamsul. We're waiting for your reflections. His audio is not coming. You need to, Shamsul, if you can hear me, you need to unmute yourself. Your audio is not coming through. On the left lower corner, you'll find the unmute button, Shamsul. I'm sorry, but we can't hear you at all. And you know, on the left lower in the slide, you find a red line across your speaker. If you can unmute that. He's calling up somebody and it's not coming. Sir, would you Bhupsa, in the meantime, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Well, gentlemen, you just now heard a lot of statistics and a lot of other details about 1971 war. I was part of it. Not only part of it, I took part in many of those exercises and the attacks which took place, which later on became the stepping stone for our victory. I like to say that firstly, that our emphasis on bare statistics and the general outlook, we have missed out on what were the important factors which finally led us to the victory. I would consider, not that I took part in it or I was the author of it, the destruction of the runway was the first and the most important step, because without that you couldn't have had the heli operations, you wouldn't have the paradrops, you wouldn't have the speed at which the Indian Army progressed, and you wouldn't have had all the other things. Right now the primacy is given to the attack on Governor's house. And over last 50 years I've been hearing that that was the one which made them surrender, and finally we liberated East Pakistan and established Bangladesh. Of course, that was a very vital action. That was a very important factor, but it came after we had demolished the runway. Why is that not played up at all? If you see a picture behind you, Air Marshal Chaudhary is there and they're saying, a Canberra is shown attacking the airfield. I don't know which airfield was this. It was the MiGs who did it. And now this is what I'm trying to hint at, that we're trying to cover up certain things, highlight certain things, and downgrade the other part of it. This, the part which irks me from the point of view that I took part in that. Now, could someone tell me which runway was this? All right. Now, to cover up that, we have given the MVCs, we've given all these kind of things to all these people. Similarly, the intelligence failure. On the night of 3rd, when I was briefed by Group Captain Mankochia, the station commander at Guwahati, what was our task? What was the task given to me? That go in, strafe or rocket the runway and the aircraft on this side. Now, where the hell is the aircraft there? What kind of dispersal is there? Where are the location of the other important thing? Was not known to us. I pleaded to him. I said, sir, those days are gone when you flew at 150 miles an hour and there were no air defense of the kind or to speak of on those things. Today, you have the quad guns, you have all kind of sophisticated systems around there. Now, you want me to climb up over that place and circle around for a minute or two, expose my 4 aircraft to the gunfire, and then we go and attack. Now, this has been totally played down. No one mentions anywhere around it, including the Air Chief Marshal Lal during his book and during his brief which he gave to the press on 19th of February 1972, he made only a passing reference, saying this, yes, we are aware there was intelligence failure, and that's all, just one sentence, it was dismissed. And thereafter it is never spoken of. It's just put under the carpet and forgotten about it. It's nice to hear the history and the stories about it, but when you were the part of it and you were the one on the receiving end, you do feel that these misses were important and we should have taken note of it. I'm sure they were taken note of it in the subsequent kind of inquiries and investigations and the committees which were formed. But we don't know what happened in that. That is still under the WOPS, somewhere in the almaras of Air Headquarters or Ministry of Defense, and put away for good, like 1962 report. Now, it's very important to say that had that action not taken place, now most important part of that is, once again, it's personal. You might take it, you might say that I'm trying to drum up my own efforts which we put in. No one has mentioned that how it came about. Firstly, that why runway was not bombed right in the beginning on the very first day. We could have got rid of the Pakistan Air Force in the first hour of the war. We didn't, because we didn't adopt the bombing of the runways.
Sir, I have your point, sir, and I know the history, sir, as you know, and your point is well taken. But let me tell you, sir, in the book, all these details are there. That's why I requested everybody else as to how the bombing came about, and I didn't even mention it here today, that quite frankly, we could have won air superiority in 2 hours instead of 2 days. But we don't want to talk about it here because of the limitations of time. Your contribution is very well known, sir. Over here, the painting that you showed, one moment, sir. The painting that you showed of the Canberras, there is no denying that the Canberras went in first on third night itself to attack the airfields. Whether they were successful or not, we are not disputing over here. That's all written in various books. Arjun has described it in his book. Jagan has talked about it, and he'll come up later in the second session. So the contribution is well known, sir. Everybody here is aware, and I know exactly how the bombing came about, sir. It's all written there, sir. Thank you. I hope that.
No, sir. It's perfectly knowledgeable that how it came about, but no one talks about it. I don't see it in writing. Even today's talk, which A.V.M. Subramaniam gave, he said, okay, this was done in a sort of generally speaking manner, not in particularly.
I fully acknowledge 28th Squadron's contribution in putting Dhaka out of constraints of time. But if you recollect, I did mention that the most decisive aerial event that took place that paved the way for subsequent success was putting Tesgaon airfield out of action. And if you recollect those two photographs that I showed, one was of Kurmitola airfield that you people practice bombed with the 500 kg bombs on 5th, and then did the same thing in Dhaka on the 6th. So there is no doubt that the aerial attacks or the runway attacks on Tesgaon is what freed up the ground forces to do what they could do in the days ahead. There's no doubt, sir. And also the mistakes that were made on 3rd and 4th as to why were you given the task of strafing Tesgaon airfield to take out with rockets and guns, whereas actually what you should have been doing was carrying out runway denial attacks on day 1 rather than hitting the aircraft. Point very well taken, sir, and it is chronicled fairly extensively.
I'm glad, sir. I'm satisfied with the answers that you have given up, but I'm hearing it for the first time in a seminar of this standard, or by any official or unofficial seminars which have taken place over the last 50 years.
So if you read my chapter in that book, it's very well chronicled. And
sir, I will go back home and read the book.
Okay, please.
I'll certainly, I'm sure, sir. Yes. And the second thing which I took about the intelligence part of it, if I could bring the photographs by taking camera around my neck during flying and send it to the Eastern Air Command on the second day of the war, why could this not be given to us? Now, you have there, sir, Air Marshal Masson. He was in 37th Squadron. They had the camera-fitted aircraft, and so was the 221 Squadron. And Air Marshal Masson tells me that they had only 3 requests for the FR sorties from the squadron. So expensively equipped with all this equipment, we didn't use it.
So we didn't talk about all this because of paucity of time.
No, I don't want to take you
time. After all, we got 15 minutes, and I haven't covered any of my portions at all today. as you noted, but it's all in the chapter, so we acknowledge this. We take your point, sir. That it has to be brought out, and that's why I said to all the youngsters and the others who are watching this particular webcast, to pick up a copy because you'll get more details over there in the individual contributions.
So my request is to Air Marshal Vikram Singh also. He's writing the history, official history. So please take note of these things.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We got just a couple of minutes, and I believe we have one question online. So.
We've got two questions. One just came in. The first one is for AVM Subramaniam. So the question says, was there a need for INS Vikrant? Couldn't its air assets have operated from the shore for better effect? That is the first question.
No. If I get it right, the question is, could the air assets of INS Vikrant operated from the shore for better effect? If you look at it, there was no airfield from where the Alizés and the Seahawks could have operated other than a seaborne platform off the coast of East Pakistan. And so therefore the question, so if you just look at those two maps that I had shown, that the INS Vikrant played a significantly coercive role on the coast of East Pakistan, because it was not only required for hitting runways at Chittagong and Cox's Bazar, but it would also required to hit shipping on the riverways and the coast. So there was no opportunity for the aircraft to operate from the shore. So they had to operate from INS Vikrant.
Great, thank you very much. Of course.
I think it's very little known that the Air Force and the Navy had agreed before the war that the Navy would not operate north of 22 degrees 25 minutes. That is just north of Chittagong. So Navy was not allowed to operate their aircraft north of latitude above Chittagong, which is really most of Bangladesh. So, I mean, there was no need for them to take part from a land-based airfield in that sense.
Thank you, sir. And there's another question from Admiral Arun Prakash, who sent it online. He says, similar to the previous discussion, are there lessons to be learned from our past conflicts about the writing of war diaries at the unit level and their collation at service HQ level? And he says this is in context of the 6 F-86 destroyed in Murid by the 20th Squadron Hunters on 8th December. And he goes on to add that this only came to light in Tufayle's book, In the Ring and On Its Feet. And this is for the panel. He hasn't mentioned anyone in particular.
No, in fact, if you see the 20 Squadron War Diary, it's there. All the gun camera shots are there. We knew, but we did not actually publicize it. In fact, even before that, one day before that, the flight commander, Colonel Rosario, had shot one more Sabre, on the ground at the same airfield earlier, one day before that. And so those gun camera shots are there. And it is there in the war diary. It may not have been publicized. That's a different matter.
And if I may add, actually, to Admiral Prakash, the portion on the west is being covered in the second session by, I think, Marshal Bhatia is covering a lot of that as to what's happening. As for lessons, I would just like to leave with one parting thought, which I wanted to say, as it must have emerged from the talks that Pakistani strategy of trying to employ the Air Force in a defensive and a subordinate manner didn't work any time. Quite frankly, Air Forces, as Arjun and the others have written many times, Air Forces by themselves are totally an aggressive weapon of war. And if you don't employ them aggressively, innovatively, based on the circumstances and the environment, which obviously depends on accurate intelligence and operational planning, you won't win the air war. So while we have talked about the lessons of 1971 war, which was like Air Marshal Chopra mentioned, was the last war perhaps, and 73 in Israel and Bekaa Valley, where aircraft, second generation aircraft without missiles largely, meddled or meleeed around in close combat and dogfights and all that, which era may have changed. I would still say that the lessons learned from there have to be taken, sifted, and applied to today's environment. Admiral Prakash, I think, was hinting at that, as to how do we apply them. We have to apply our mind and say, what is the environment today? How can I now use the Air Force aggressively, innovatively, to win the battle in the air? Because unless you control air and space, there is no denying you cannot control the surface. Well, that's a lesson that we have to take home. But I'll leave it to younger air warriors who are practitioners today and who are current with the technology of the day, doctrines and strategy, to distill this into their planes. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for a very patient hearing. We run out of time, so I won't say any more. Thank you to the panel. Grateful to all of you for contributing. And
thank you, Chair and speakers, for your valuable insights. I request Air Marshal Anil Chopra, DG CAPS, to present the guests with a token of appreciation.
that you can learn from them. Thank you. Thank you.